there's two major paradigms for scaling blockchains, right? As you said, layer one and layer two. And layer one basically means make the blockchain itself capable of processing more transactions by having some mechanism by which it can do that, despite the fact that there's a limit to the capacity of each participant in the blockchain. And then layer two says, well, we're going to keep the blockchain as is, but we're going to create clever protocols that sit on top of the blockchain that still use the blockchain and then still kind of inherit things like the security guarantees of a blockchain. But at the same time, a lot of things are done off-chain, and so you get more scalability that way. So in Ethereum, the most popular paradigm for layer two is rollups, and the most popular paradigm for layer one is sharding.
I know that there's a lot of projects that are increasingly looking at the rollups because the rollups are much shorter term than things like sharding, right? That'll probably take maybe potentially 1 to 2 years to get out there. Whereas rollups, the optimistic ones are coming in a few months. The ZK rollups that are, they use fancier technology, but they're actually simpler because they only support a couple of applications instead of general purpose smart contracts. Like some of them are here already.
The two ways Ethereum can scale are through layer 2 solutions like rollups and layer 1 solutions like sharding. Sharding is a superior scaling solution, but the technology is not ready to be implemented yet. Rollups are ready now, but have their own flaws and limitations. The two kinds of rollups are optimistic rollups and ZK rollups.
In an optimistic rollup, the way that you ensure that the results are correct is that you let one person submit, and they just submit with no proof. They just say, here's what I think the result is. And then if someone else disagrees, they make their own submission. And then if you have two disagreeing submissions, then you actually publish it on chain and you see who's right. But for this to work, you need to actually wait for someone to disagree, right? So for example, if I have an asset inside of an optimistic rollup and I want to withdraw it, then I actually have to wait a week to withdraw it because if the a block that contains my withdrawal turned out to be invalid, then there needs to be space for someone to disagree with it. The ZK rollup, you don't need time for disagreement because you just have a proof, right? As soon as a block is submitted, there's a proof and it's correct. The reason why ZK rollups are not winning everywhere today is because, ZK Starks is still a crazy new technology, right? This is something that 10 years ago, it existed only in theory and there was none in practice. ZK technology has only really become efficient enough to do a lot of things within the past maybe 1.5 years. Mm-hmm. So it's new technology, it's crazy technology, it's admittedly scary technology.
So rollups are powerful, but they do have the one limitation, which is that you do need some amount of data on chain for every transaction. And the reason why you need data on chain is basically because in order to guarantee that people can withdraw, you need to have enough data on chain so that anyone can reconstruct the rollups internal state, and if the rollups internal balance Merkle tree that contains the balances and so forth. And so it's about 16 bytes on chain for the rollups that are designed well, and that's 6 times less than regular transactions. But then the scaling factor goes up to about 100 because you get rid of all the computation, right? But there is this amount of data, and so ultimately the capacity of the system is bounded by something like 3,000 TPS right now. In the long term, if we want to get more users and more cheaper non-financial applications, we're going to have to go even higher than 3,000 TPS. And so that basically means scaling the data layer and designing the data layer in such a way that you can verify its integrity without every single participant having to personally download and check the availability of all of the data.
While rollups are not perfect, they do offer an immediate solution to Ethereum's scaling problem. Scaling the data layer through sharding is more effective, but it has its own drawbacks.
So sharding basically says, well, instead of just increasing the parameters, what we're going to do is we're going to change the blockchain architecture in such a way that each individual node in the blockchain only needs to store a small portion of the data and only needs to process a small portion of the transactions. So you can think about it as being inspired by BitTorrent, right? On BitTorrent, there's no such thing as a BitTorrent full node that has every movie, right? The work is split up among a huge number of computers, and that makes sense. That's the only sane way to scale a system like that. The challenge with taking that model and applying it to blockchains, right, is that blockchains aren't just about spreading data around. They're about agreeing on exactly what data was spread around and ensuring that everything that you agree on actually is correct. So you have this paradox where, let's say you want to have a system that supports 10,000 transactions a second, but each computer in the network can only personally verify 100 transactions a second. So how can each computer get a guarantee about the other 9,900 without actually going and verifying them themselves?
Yep.
And it turns out that there are some like a bundle of different tricks that can do that, right? So like one of them is just random sampling. So the idea behind random sampling is, like, let's say for simplicity, this is a proof of stake chain, and you have 10,000 validators. Validators are like, the stakers. And like for simplicity, we'll assume they all have the same number of coins, right? If someone has more coins, we'll just kind of split them up and pretend they're 10 stakers. Then you do like some random shuffling, and you basically say these random 100 validators are assigned to validate this block. These random 100 validators are assigned to validate this block. These random 100 validators are assigned to validate this block. And so each individual computer only gets assigned to validate like a small piece. The way that the information about like what's valid gets passed around, right, is that when these 100 participants validate a block, they all sign a message basically saying like, yes, we agree that this block is valid. And then like they combine that signature into one, and then they broadcast that signature. And then everyone else, instead of verifying the blocks directly, just verifies that signature, right? And so if I see the signature, I'm not directly convinced that that block is valid, but what I am convinced of is that out of this committee of, or this randomly selected group of 100 validators, let's say at least 70 of them agree that this block is valid. Mm-hmm. And so if I trust that, the majority of these participants are all honest, then because it's all randomly selected, the attacker can't just like force themselves into one committee. And so, the attacker is going to be evenly spread out too. And so if, the entire set of validators is mostly honest, every committee is going to be mostly honest. And so like bad blocks are not going to go through, right?
There are limits and kind of complicated trade-offs on how far you can scale a sharding system. Like basically the higher the higher the number of shards that you push, the higher the minimum number of users the system needs to have in order to be safe. And so as you scale it up more, it becomes more brittle.
Scaling layer 1 through sharding has its own flaws and is a ways away from being ready.
Realistically, in the long term, using L1 is just going to keep getting more and more expensive. So you, like, as a user, I think like you do need to be prepared for the fact that Ethereum already is transitioning away from being a layer 1 centric ecosystem toward being a layer 2 centric ecosystem. I like today the gains that you can make from switching to layer 2 are like maybe only 5x, but in the future there'll be 10x, and then there'll be 50x, and then there'll be 1000x. So eventually all activity is going to have to transition to being layer 2.
Scaling through layer 2 solutions are here now, but there are risks anytime you move or bridge to different chains.
Once you start going between chains, there are all of these really complicated issues that don't exist if you stick on like any one of the chains. And that is a concern. The bridges are an interesting position where like the way that I describe it is like they have anti-network effects in that I think cross-chain bridges become less secure the more users they have. And so if there are only a few people using them, then I would trust them. I would say that they're very safe. But the more people start using them, the more incentive there is for people to attack them so they can like steal money from all the users at the same time. So, like, I would feel more comfortable using the bridges when they have 50,000 like ETH in them than when they have like 500,000 or 5 million, right? So, like, I definitely expect them continue to be used, but are they going to be this like really big thing that turns assets into something that's like very independent from which layer they're issued on? I would say no.
Polygon, the largest layer 2 chain, uses roll-up technology to help scale Ethereum.
In Polygon, which is a sidechain, and so instead of being secured by Ethereum, it's also in part secured by its own proof of stake consensus with its own token. So if 70% of the whole, or even 51% of the holders of Polygon tokens wanted to take my money in Polygon, they can, right? Mm-hmm. So that's and like, to be fair, like there aren't even like the supply I don't think is even that widely distributed, right? So like potentially you could this idea of 51% of the token holders coming together and stealing everything, like it's It's not impossible.
That's kind of the core technical reason why I think in the long term, if we want to kind of achieve the system's full potential, like you basically need to have rollups and sharding and stack the two on top of each other. But like if you have different trade-offs, so you could definitely get to like a medium level of scalability with just rollups. We've been fairly clear since the beginning that scalability is going to depend on future things, and those are things that we've been really actively talking about in like pretty much any Ethereum kind of discussion since even 2014. Though the thing that I think you can say fairly is that we did underestimate the amount of time until those technologies would be ready. But I mean, in terms of just like fundamental feasibility, we've definitely come quite far. And now we're in the earlier phases of ETH2 are in test nets, and rollups which actually would provide like up 2 orders of magnitude of scalability for a lot of things. Actually, are months away from production. So.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I think like timing was probably the main issue, where expectations in reality ended up being relatively disjoint from each other.
Properly scaling a decentralized blockchain is easier said than done. As of early 2022, here's how close Ethereum is to being completed in percentage terms according to Vitalik.
I would say around 50. I'd be willing to go past 60 once the merge is fully complete, and I'd be willing to go past 80 once we have a full sharding implementation. But I think those two biggest items are definitely getting closer and closer, but they're not yet in the rear view mirror.
Like, I definitely don't think that we discovered any fundamental flaws that make it impossible, and I think it will be finished. It's just a matter of time, and it's actually been kind of progressing quite quickly lately. There's a lot of technical complexity in making a successful proof of stake chain. There's a lot of technical complexity in actually figuring out the transition process.
So that's bigger than social complexity. So it's the technical complexity, you would say, is the bigger reason for any delays than the social complexity.
I actually think so. I think we've been very fortunate to not have too much social complexity around the merge.
The merge that Vitalik is referring to is the transition from proof of work to proof of stake, which is a key component in the roadmap to complete Ethereum.